Well, good evening. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow, Hudson Institute, and it's an honor and a privilege to have with us tonight as our special guest, Senator Tom Cotton. Senator Cotton has, as you know, has just published a book, Sacred Duty, which you can purchase at the table at the end of the glass doors there as part of your contribution to your enlightenment and learning. I will also say that after Q&A, Senator Cotton has graciously agreed to sign copies of the book. He'll be set up at the table at the far end of the foyer there, the one with the blue tablecloth. And so what we'll ask you to do is, if you'd like the Senator to sign your copy, is to queue up, and he said he'll be happy to do so at the end of the event. Two other housekeeping matters. One is all of you will have or should have received a card as you came and sat down. If you've got a question for the Senator, a question about the book, please write those down, and we'll have people coming by down the rows to pick them up. And when I finish my section of the questions and discussion, then we'll ask questions that appear in the card and other direction. Last bit of housekeeping, turn off your cell phones. Now, Senator Tom Cotton, if you want to find out about Senator Cotton, one of the things you can do is you can go to his website at the U.S. Senate. And what you'll find when you check that out is a description of Senator Cotton, which is, shall we say, Spartan, comparatively Spartan compared to the descriptions of some other senators. He's a U.S. Senator from Arkansas, or as Senator Cotton likes to say, a senator for Arkansas. He grew up on his family's cattle farm in Yell County. You gotta love that name, Yell County. He graduated from Dardanelle High School. I looked up Dardanelle High School. It's off of Highway 28 in Dardanelle, Arkansas. It reminds me a lot of my high school in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, Stevens Point area senior high school. It's a high school, and you're proud to have gone there. Its team mascot is the Sand Lizards, is that correct?
Only one in the nation.
Only one in the nation were the Sand Lizards. And after Dardanelle High School, he went on to Harvard and then Harvard Law School. And after a clerkship in the U.S. Court of Appeals, Senator Cotton left the law because of the September 11th attacks. Like many that we know, he decided that his country was calling, and he served nearly 5 years in active duty in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer. He served in Iraq with 101st Airborne and in Afghanistan with a provincial reconstruction team. Between his two combat tours, he served with the Old Guard in Arlington National Cemetery. His military decorations include the Bronze Star Medal, Combat Infantry Badge, and Ranger Tab. What you also learn is, in addition to his service in the Senate, on the Banking Committee and the Economic Policy Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and the Armed Services Committee, he also has, and his wife Anna, have two sons, Gabriel and Daniel. That's what the website will tell you about Senator Tom Cotton. What it won't tell you about him is that he is one of the rising stars in today's U.S. Senate. He is becoming an important and influential voice in this country's foreign policy as well as defense policy. And I can tell you from personal testimony from others in the Senate that in this age of polarized politics, Tom Cotton is someone whose voice and someone whose views carry great weight on both sides of the aisle, and someone whose trust on the part of his colleagues runs very deep and covers a wide range of issues. Senator Cotton, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Arthur.
And it's
back at Hudson.
And it's also a pleasure, if I may say, to welcome you to the ranks of book authors, and particularly the first author. And this one, The Sacred Duty, The Soldier's Tour at Arlington's National Cemetery. Now, this book, as you will find out, is about the most famous U.S. Army unit you've never heard of, which is so-called Old Guard, the Third Infantry Regiment, created before we had a Constitution, going back to 1784. Now, you may not know about the existence of the Old Guard and the Third Infantry Regiment, but you've seen them. You've seen them on duty at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. You've seen them on duty at the arrival of caskets at Dover Air Force Base. You've seen photographs of them in presidential events and at full honor funerals. Now, to become, as you'll learn when you read the book, to become one of the Old Guard requires rigorous physical as well as mental qualifications. They only accept applicants, and they only accept volunteers. If you're a male, you have to be between the heights of 5'10" and 6'4". For women, the height requirement is 5'8" to 6'2". As I say, in order to be accepted into the Old Guard, you have to be a volunteer. Senator Cotton, you weren't. What happened?
We honored that in the breach, I suppose. I was what they say in the Army, voluntold. I was going to the Old Guard. So I was in Iraq in 2006, and the Army was strained in those days by the missions our nation had given it, yet it didn't have enough troops to perform all those missions. One effect of that, those of you who were involved in defense policy in those days, meant that soldiers were deploying to Afghanistan or Iraq every 9, 10, 11 months, as opposed to, say, 18 to 24-month tours they would later have, or time between tours. Another side effect of that is that the Old Guard was short of officers. And in the Old Guard, if an officer is called for to march on the parade field or conduct a funeral in Arlington, it has to be an officer. It can't be filled in by a senior sergeant the way you can on the battlefield when an officer is absent. So that means the officers who are there get overworked. So the Old Guard, which is a priority unit for the Army, got permission to just hand select 6 young lieutenants and captains, all returning from our tour with the 101st Airborne. Now, since I didn't file the application, and you would know if you file the application, it's very long and detailed, I called the personnel officer at the Old Guard, the adjutant from Iraq, and asked him about this, and he said, yeah, we hand-selected 6 of you. I was like, oh, well, how did you do that? Because normally if you're hand-selected in the Army, there's good reason for it. Oftentimes you've performed your job proficiently, and the Army wants to promote you or give you greater responsibility. And he said, well, we searched all the personnel records for the basic requirements. You lay down a bunch of them. And I said, well, there must be lots of lieutenants and captains in infantry that fit those. And he said, yeah, there are a couple hundred at least. He said, well, how did you choose 6 of us? At this point, I was certain it was going to be my superior performance as a new lieutenant in Iraq.
Fishing for compliments.
He said, we rank ordered you by height and chose the 6 tallest ones. And sure enough, about 4 or 5 months later, there were 6 new Old Guard officers, and we all had 101st Airborne Screaming Eagle combat patches on our right shoulder, and one was 6'7", and I'm 6'5", and the other 4 are 6'3". That upper height limit is also something that's honored in the breach, primarily. In a few units there, where in particular some of the ceremonial units that perform at the Pentagon and the White House, because they want the tallest, most imposing soldiers to be present for foreign heads of state and ministers of defense and chiefs of defense.
So the Third Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, is a ceremonial unit that performs in full dress for a number of ceremonies, but it's not just a ceremonial. It's also a combat unit. It has a long, distinguished combat history.
It gets its name from Winfield Scott, who himself was the longest-serving general in American history, since they made him general at the age of, I think, 27 or 28 in the War of 1812, and he served until the Civil War. I don't think anyone's going to catch up with him in today's Army. But he served with the Old Guard outside Niagara Falls in 1814, and then 33 years later, he was their commanding officer on the second major campaign in the Mexican War in 1847, the Mexico City campaign on the march up from Veracruz to Mexico City. And partly, I'm sure, because of their valorous performance in that campaign, but partly because of his old history with the Old Guard, then known as the Third Infantry Regiment, as it still is officially today. He put them in the place of honor, the head of the parade, marching into Mexico City after the Mexican army had run away. And as they marched past the reviewing stand, he turned around to his staff and he said, "Gentlemen, take your hats off to the Old Guard of the Army." The name has stuck ever since. And today they remain an infantry regiment. They will train on infantry tasks down at Fort A.P. Hill, about 90 miles to our south, up to either the fire team or the squad level. They can't go much beyond that because their primary missions are funerals and ceremonies. But their third mission is what they call defense support to civilian authorities, or what you might say emergency or contingency operations here in the capital region. Some of those are planned. So there'll be a contingent of Old Guard companies that are mobilized on events like State of the Union, to put it bluntly, wear combat fatigues and sit on rucksacks in case anything happens, so they can support the Secret Service, the DC Police, the Park Police, and so forth. But sometimes those contingencies are real. On September 11th, 2001, American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m., which was in the middle of the 9 o'clock funerals. And those funerals continued. They continued all day long. But for every Old Guard trooper who was not present in the cemetery for funerals, they took off the ceremonial uniforms and put on their fatigues and rushed down to the Pentagon. And they stayed there for 30 days in the early hours performing security and providing first aid to the wounded. In the later days, helping with the recovery of remains from all those who'd been killed in the Pentagon, because they're the only large regiment in the capital region that's made up of young, physically fit infantrymen. Lots of colonels and generals in the region and lots of people to staff them, but not so many young infantrymen. And they stayed there for 30 days to help with that job. And after 9/11, from 2003 to 2010, another indicator of the strain on the Army, the Old Guard deployed companies overseas 3 times to support the war on terror, twice to Djibouti and once to Iraq.
Yeah. One of the virtues of this book are the beautiful photographs, the color photographs, which show them members of the Old Guard and all the different ceremonial tasks that they perform, including the range of uniforms they perform, including period uniforms from the Revolutionary War. But without doubt, the most famous of all the ceremonies that they perform and guard duty that they do is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier platoon is probably the most specialized unit within the Old Guard. There's only about 25 or 30 soldiers there at a time. It can take 9 to 12 months to earn your badge as a Tomb Guard, and the attrition rate for that badge can approach 90%. It's the second rarest badge in the entire Army. As of today, there's only been 667 awarded in over 60 years. The astronaut badge is the rarest badge, but as the Tomb Guards like to say, who joins the Army to be an astronaut? Come on. But that is a volunteer unit, and it takes a tremendous amount of discipline and dedication to meet their extremely rigorous standards. It's one reason why the attrition rate there approaches 90%, and that's even among soldiers who are recruited from within the Old Guard, who have already demonstrated proficiency at the Old Guard's unique mission. But they're some of the most disciplined, capable, and motivated young soldiers I've ever met in the military, and they truly are, in many cases, very young. The bulk of those 25 to 30 Tomb Guards are probably private first class specialists. So you're talking about young soldiers who are 19, 20, 21, 22 years old guarding that tomb, as they have been for every minute of every day since they became the ceremonial unit in 1948. It was guarded previously for 11 years by other detachments at Fort Myer and in the capital region, but they've had that job since April 6, 1948.
You have a very interesting discussion also about how they selected the unknown soldier and the process by which they tried to arrive at someone who would be truly unknown, even switching the caskets around until one would be chosen. And one of the fascinating things also about the book is your description of the rigorous process by which the members of the tomb unit sort of have to prepare themselves in terms of dress. I mean, it's a demanding zero-fail type of a job.
It is, in part because the platoon's operating manual says this is the most prominent guard post in the United States. And there's hundreds and hundreds of young soldier, sailor, airmen, and Marines pulling guard duty all around the country right now at bases and installation of various kinds. The Old Guard, or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, is obviously the most prominent one. So even soldiers who have learned the Old Guard standard of uniform preparation, which can take dozens and dozens of hours, as it did for me to prepare my uniform with those perfect creases and handmade medals and insignia before I started performing funerals or cemeteries, have to relearn many new techniques. And some of the things they do, for instance, they are the only soldiers allowed to do. The gentlemen here who are wearing coats, either sports coats or suit coats, probably have some kind of liner inside of it, just like our uniforms at the Old Guard did. But when you press the liner on one of those big industrial-sized presses that we had in all of our barracks basements for our uniform, it can press in the seams of those liners. So you got to steam it out. It takes a long time. What they do at the tomb, though, because there's so few and it's such high stakes, they just cut all that out. They cut out the pockets in their pants and just stitch up the pockets. They do all that to make sure they don't have the slightest defect in their uniform, because they understand that of the 4 million people that visit Arlington every year, the vast majority of them will walk up that hill and watch the changing of the guard, and they want to make sure that everything is exactly right. And that's why they have inspections before they get out the door in their underground quarters underneath the amphitheater. But they also have an inspection block on the plaza itself, and that's a genuine inspection. It's a significant emotional event if there's a defect in that inspection block, but I have seen it, and I have seen it corrected. Normally it's just adjusting a hat that maybe got blown around on the walkover or something like that. But they take their craft very, very seriously. They can spend hours and hours and hours each night to get their uniform ready for the next day after a day's guard. But as one of them said to me, in a phrase I heard a lot at the tomb, these three unknowns didn't just give their lives for our nation, they gave their very identity. What is it to us? What kind of sacrifice is it if we were to give a night of sleep up to make sure that our uniforms were perfect for the next day of guard duty?
So the question I have to ask, which I'm sure is in other people's minds too, when you decided you were going to write a book, you could have written a book about your experience in Iraq, about Afghanistan. You may still, it's quite possible, you're on a roll here. What made you decide to do a book on this subject?
Well, many young soldiers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan have written many fine books about those experiences. No one has ever written, to my knowledge, a book about the Old Guard. There have been books about Arlington National Cemetery that included some commentary about the Old Guard. There will probably be some news commentary and video features this weekend for Memorial Day about the cemetery that will also have some touching attention to the Old Guard. But to my knowledge, there's never been a full book-length treatment of their story, and I think it's a terrific story.
It is.
All of you do as well.
Yeah, it is.
And I think they deserve to be told, and I think also that we entrust those young soldiers with a tremendous responsibility. We entrust them with a sacred duty. We expect the very highest from them on our behalf as a people to demonstrate our respect and reverence and even love for those who have laid down their life in battle for our nation. And that's a story that deserves to be told wide and far, because I think it says a lot about who we are as a people and the things that we hold dear.
Now, how with your schedule did you find time to write this book? And by the way, just for audience's knowledge, I checked through the acknowledgments here, and there is no reference to, I want to thank my ghostwriter. I want to thank so-and-so for helping to pull this mountain of notes into a complete manuscript. It's pretty clear you wrote this book yourself. How did you find time for it, given your schedule?
For better or worse, I did write the book. I won't be able to use the famous Charles Barkley line when he had lines from his autobiography thrown back in his face, and he claimed that he was misquoted in his own autobiography. Lots of nights and weekends. I'm very familiar with the Old Guard missions, obviously, having performed those missions and occasionally attending them over the last 6 years as well, because they do perform some pretty high-profile events. I specifically attended several of the events this past year that I might have attended as a senator otherwise, such as the retirement of your own Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster last year, the state arrival ceremony just up the street on the south lawn of the White House for Emmanuel Macron. But I also just spent a lot of time with soldiers, in between my votes in the Senate or my committee hearings, On Mondays and Fridays, when the Senate isn't as active, I go over to the conference room at the regimental headquarters and sit down and interview some of the soldiers, talk to them about their experiences. Obviously, as you'll see if you read the book, there's a wide and diverse array of units and missions. I never personally guarded the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I never played a fife or a drum in the Fife and Drum Corps. I never rode a horse in the caisson platoon. I never served as the commander of the drill team. So I had to learn a lot about those units and how they operate from those young soldiers. And as you'll see, the Old Guard is primarily their story and the story of the regiment. It's not my story. My story is just a very, very short chapter, maybe like a clause in one sentence in one chapter in the Old Guard's 230-plus year history. And then nights and weekends, put the boys down by 7:30 and work until I get too tired, and then weekends work for as long as I can.
Well, that's how it's done, and that's how it gets done for people, whether you've written 9 books or whether you've written your first book. It's a solitary slog.
Yeah, my top editor, who lives with me and is related to me by marriage, played a big role in it.
Oh, that helps too. That doesn't hurt, by the way, just to let you know, either. Well, I have to tell you, my last observation about there's a lot of really gripping stories and fascinating, riveting sentences and passages in it, but there's one in particular. It comes at the beginning, in the prologue, that really struck me, and it was where you say, in the end, the story of the Old Guard of Arlington is not only a tale about our war dead and the soldiers who honor them, but also a story about ourselves as a nation, because they are as old as the nation. And it reminded me of something that Herman Wouk, who just died last week, wrote. And he said that, and just thinking about this, not just the Old Guard, but our military service and our veterans as a whole, he wrote, heroes are not supermen. They are good men, and we would say today good women, who embody, by the cast of destiny, the virtue of their whole people in a great hour. And I can't think of a better way in which to summarize both the men who guard the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and at Arlington Cemetery, as well as those who they honor and guard.
I think that is a good way to kind of sum it up. They've been present for some of the defining moments in our nation's history, even if those moments are largely lost to the mist of time. The Old Guard's first assignments, for instance, was on the frontier at a time when the frontier was what we now refer to as places like Cincinnati and Toledo and Fort Wayne. They lost 2 major battles to Indian tribes that were supported by the British, who were not upholding their obligations under our peace treaty to withdraw from what was in the Northwest Territories. In fact, one of those battles remains the bloodiest battle in the history between the United States Army and an Indian tribe, worse even than Custer's last stand in Montana.
No kidding.
A century later. Imagine how different our history might have been if the Old Guard hadn't been present and formed the core of Mad Anthony Wayne's fighting force at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and been able to eject Great Britain out of what is now the United States and into Canada. Or, for instance, at the first Battle of Bull Run, when the Union forces, which were largely a very ill-trained, ill-equipped, ill-organized fighting force, were routed, and the Old Guard, along with some of the other federal regiments, the professional fighting soldiers, somewhat ingloriously covered their retreat back to Arlington, of all places, but nonetheless covered their retreat. And just a few days later up the road, there was a review of troops for President Lincoln with Irwin McDowell, who was the commanding general at the time, not much longer after that battle of Bull Run. And he pointed out those Old Guard troops and the other regulars and said to Abraham Lincoln, these are the men that saved your army. Think how different our history might have been if that army hadn't been saved at the first Battle of Bull Run. So they really have been present as America went from being a small colonial backwater to being a continental power to being a worldwide power.
Yeah. And if Stonewall Jackson had been able to say, the road's open to Washington, let's take it. Should we take some questions from the audience? Here's one. The question is, how did your military service shape the man you are today? And then at the bottom it says, go Army. Obviously an unbiased member of the audience.
So I will say that sometimes people ask if my military experience shapes my worldview about the threats we face and the way to prevent those threats from gathering into grave danger against our nation. And my response is that's close to the way it worked, except it was the exact opposite. One of the reasons I joined the Army is I already had those views, and I wanted to fight and defend our nation. But there's no doubt that serving in our military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Marine, but it sounds like your writers is somewhat particular to the Army, which I may be as well, shapes you as a person. It teaches you intangible skills in particular. I mean, it teaches you how to fly a helicopter, an airplane, or to scuba dive, or jump out of an airplane, or to fire a rifle, or what have you. But the intangible skills it teaches you, like leadership, mission focus, motivation, teamwork, discipline, acting on imperfect information in ambiguous circumstances when the stakes are extremely high, are things that stand you well in any walk of life, whether it's Congress or working for any employer as well. That's one reason why so many employers recognize that the best thing they can do is hire a veteran. I mean, you need professional training. You can't hire a veteran to be an architect if he's not certified to be an architect. But if you have any job in your company that's just a management job or leadership job, even if that veteran knows nothing about the industry, you can usually hire that veteran, and within 90 days, he's going to know more than most of your other workers, and he's certainly going to be a better leader and manager of people than those are.
Yeah. They're self-starters. One of the things you learn. Now, the next member of audience turns that question around and says, given your education and background at the time at which you entered military service, did you find your approach or perspective to differ from those who entered through a more conventional route?
I had to join the Army in part to redeem myself for having gone to law school, obviously. But no, I can't say I did. For me, probably the bigger advantage for the unusual route I took into the Army was my age. When I was a second lieutenant and platoon leader in Iraq, I was 29 years old. Typically, a lieutenant would be 23 years old. I obviously had some life experience behind me. I had worked in a law firm, and on multiple occasions, I had had some of the legal assistants, paralegals, secretaries pull my fat out of the fire at the last minute. And having benefited from their much greater experience, I was given those experiences and my age, I had really internalized before I even got into the Army the message that all young lieutenants are taught, which is listen to your NCOs. Because when you show up as a platoon leader, you're by definition on that day the least experienced soldier in your platoon, even though you are also the soldier in charge. But if you listen to your NCOs, who wouldn't be in the positions they are if the Army didn't have confidence in them, they will set you up for success, just like so many people in my very short and inglorious legal career had set me up for success as well. So I'd say more than anything, it was my age and experience in the world that helped me in the Army as opposed to coming straight out of ROTC or West Point.
Yeah. Now this question, you've been both a soldier following orders and a senator crafting foreign policy strategies.
A senator not following orders, Senator McConnell would probably say.
Well, Senator McConnell's not here to back that up, so we're just gonna press on. Do you believe that our leaders failed our soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan, mentions Vietnam, and then maybe a bigger question, how can we do better?
I'd say we certainly made mistakes in all those wars, obviously. The mistake that was forefront in my life was the mistake that we made in keeping troop levels too low for too long in Iraq. There was, after major combat operations ended in 3 to 4 weeks with the toppling of Saddam Hussein's government, there was something of a rush to try to draw down our troops very rapidly. One thing we had seen 3 years on by the time I was in Iraq was that there's nothing that can happen without security. It's true in our cities, in our towns. If you don't have safe streets, what else can you have? You can't have growing businesses, you can't have healthy neighborhoods, you can't have children learning. Same is true anywhere in the world. If you don't have security, you can have nothing else. And by the summer of 2006, for anyone on the front lines, by which I mean at least the battalion level and below, the people who are out on patrol every day, we could clearly see that our strategy wasn't working. We needed a different strategy. We needed more troops to implement that strategy. I have to say, when I was leaving Iraq right after the election in 2006, Thanksgiving week of 2006, I did not have a high degree of confidence that things were going to turn out the way they did about 6 weeks later, when President Bush rejected the advice, the conventional wisdom of almost everyone in Washington, to include many members of the cabinet and almost everyone in Congress, that he beat a hasty retreat, but rather that he doubled down on the surge. And I think when historians look back, in particular military historians, they will see that as his finest hour. He made mistakes. Our senior commanders made mistakes. Abraham Lincoln made mistakes as well in the early days of the Civil War. Our commanders in the Civil War made many mistakes too. War is a complicated business, and once it starts, you never know quite how it's going to turn out. But I can tell you that by the time I got to the Old Guard in March of 2007, we were performing the dignified transfer of remains at Dover Air Force Base almost every night.
Wow.
By the time I left the Old Guard in July 2008, it was a surprise that we had to perform that mission. So we saw there at Dover just how much the surge had succeeded at great price on the front end, but large gains on the back end.
Yeah. Winston Churchill in the Western Desert, where he suffered disaster after disaster, was firing generals just as fast as he could until he found one, Montgomery, who would do the job. Some people say that perhaps one of the problems we had in Iraq was that President Bush trusted the generals too much on their advice. I'm not trying to put you on the spot of being critical of any particular generals, but how important is it to have a president who both listens to his military leaders, and we know examples, I think of President Johnson, who tended to feel like he had to go his own way, as opposed to ones who understand that there may be a larger strategic picture that his warfighters don't
I think
grasp.
So I think it was Churchill who said of civilian-military relations, it is always right to probe, and sometimes our civilian leaders don't probe hard enough and ask the hardest questions. As the military has become more professionalized over the last 70 years as well, that may be more the case, although it's a consistent theme throughout American history. You know, Abraham Lincoln went through a succession of generals before he found Ulysses S. Grant that would do the work that he wanted done. You know, when you write a book like this and you read a lot of original materials, it is somewhat mystifying why a president would stick with so many generals for so long who didn't pursue his core objective, which was the destruction of Robert E. Lee's army, as opposed to marching on Richmond, which failed over and over again because they left Robert E. Lee's army in the field. But that's just an example of the kind of mistakes that usually are made by both heads of state, whether they're presidents or prime ministers, and by the senior generals who are in charge. Again, war is a complicated and dangerous business, and once it starts, you never can know quite how it's going to turn out or the path it will take to get there.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest changes that I've noticed, and it's a positive change, has been just simply the growth in the public attitude with regard to veterans. And I remember, which you probably don't, when the debate took place of whether to go to an all-volunteer force. And two of the arguments that were presented as why we should not were, number one, that what was going to happen is that we would create a professional elite of military who would be embarked on military adventures, and that civilian control would be lost because they weren't rooted in the public as they were through the draft. The other argument on the other side is that an all-volunteer force, that because they'll lose their roots in the society at large, that they'll become increasingly marginalized, and that Americans will view the military the way the French talk about the French Foreign Legion. You know, you read in Le Monde about a number of legionnaires getting killed somewhere in Zaire, and so that's interesting, and then you order your coffee and croissant. But the opposite has happened, hasn't it? I mean, what you really noticed with the Iraq and Afghanistan is that the sense of connection to our veterans and communities connecting has grown, if anything, stronger as a result of that. And now it's like, you know, they have really become a kind of revered group in our society in ways that I think are really quite gratifying and yet also somewhat surprising.
I think that's very much the case. I can't think of many times in American history when our active duty professional military has been so celebrated. Obviously, after great wars like the Civil War, World War I, there were many victory parades and celebrations of our troops. Those were mostly volunteer forces that were raised through volunteers or the draft in those wars. It wasn't until really after World War II that we maintained a large standing force under arms, which goes back to our colonial history. But the all-volunteer force over the last 40 years has been good, not just, in my opinion, for the professional skill and discipline of our military, but also for its esprit de corps, for its high morale. And the closer, Robert Kaplan has written in some of his books about this, the closer you get to the front lines, the higher the esprit de corps. He found writing in the middle of the last decade that the highest morale troopers he found were, the Marines who were in small, godforsaken outposts in Fallujah with barely enough drinking water to mix their MREs, had the highest morale. The lowest level morale was, the clerk sitting in the Kuwait airport telling you what the next
rear
flight,
echelon,
what the flight was. And I think that's in part a result of having an all-volunteer military, and also too Bob Gates has written in his books that the secret in Washington is that the biggest dubs have stars on their shoulders. You've seen that time and time again, is that our generals and our admirals sometimes can be the strongest voice of restraint, in no small part because many of them had experiences like I did and all those Old Guard soldiers did, of having to carry flag-draped remains off an aircraft at Dover Air Force Base, or having to preside over a ramp ceremony at Bagram or at Baghdad International. So they've seen up close the cost of war whenever civilians back in Washington send our young men and women into war. That doesn't mean that they don't have to do that at time to defend our national interest, but they know, unlike most other of our leaders in government, what that awful price can be.
Now, we have a growing proportion of members of Congress who are veterans, you in the Senate. Do you feel that there's a set of shared common interests among you because of that, despite being Republicans and Democrats?
Sure, we obviously have different viewpoints, just like veterans from World War II and Korea and Vietnam had different viewpoints as well. The Army takes all comers. I didn't talk to many soldiers about their politics, but I bet I talked to lots of conservative Republicans, and I bet I talked to some liberal Democrats too. But you can't help but feel that degree of kinship and camaraderie, especially those who served where you might have served or under similar conditions that you might have served in as well. And I think that trend will continue over time. I was a little young for my election to the House of Representatives in 2012. I'm still a lot young for the U.S. Senate compared to some of my coworkers. But as my generation of veterans get into their 40s, and especially then into their 50s, I think we'll begin to see many more veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan reach the stage in life where they are running for the House and running for the Senate. I think that'll be a good thing for our country.
Yeah. Last question from the audience is this. I am a volunteer at the U.S. Old Guard Lounge at Fort Myer. Do you ever stop by for R&R there? I think you've got an offer for a free drink if you do.
It's a great lounge. It's a very, very dark and old military-style lounge, I'll tell you that much. No, I don't stop there very much. I did conduct a few interviews there last year, though, about John McCain's funeral and George H.W. Bush's funeral, because the Old Guard played a central role in those funerals, as they do in all state funerals or any funeral that has elements of a state funeral. So I've been back there recently, but I don't stop very often for R&R, I think. Nor did I when I was in the Old Guard. I think that tends to be more of the retired flag officers there. And the young lieutenants and sergeants, they may walk across the street to Clarendon and go to the Clarendon Ballroom or Liberty Tavern for their evenings out on the town.
Well, anyway, all I can tell you is I think you've got a free drink the minute you stop by. That's for sure. Anyway, should we thank our distinguished guests for coming? Now, as I mentioned, take position at the signing desk.
And you're welcome to buy many more than just one copy of
Yeah, that is, there's no requirement, one per customer. Good, cheers.